Kentucky is one of a dozen states that's banned abortion. Yet more Kentucky women are having abortions today than prior to the ban that went into effect in 2022. Now, many women are crossing state lines into Illinois or Ohio to get an abortion, and many more are receiving life-ending drugs through the mail to end the unborn life in their womb. So, have abortion restrictions failed? Have pro-lifers missed something in their quest to protect vulnerable unborn life? And where does the pro-life movement go from here? Joining us to talk further is David Bereit, the Executive Director of the Life Leadership Conference. He's also the founder of the International 40 Days for Life movement. David serves on the Equal Rights Institute Board of Advisors and is the co-author of 40 Days for Life, Discover What God Has Done, Imagine What He Can Do. Now, I recently heard David speak at the Alliance Defending Freedom Summit, and I was inspired by his thoughts on how lasting change begins upstream before it reaches politics and public policy. And he joins us today to discuss this same important topic. David, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Oh my goodness, it is so wonderful to be here, Richard, and I thank you for inviting me and looking forward to a vigorous discussion today.
Yeah, hey, I got to see you in person along with, I believe it was over 1,000 other attendees at that Alliance Defending Freedom Conference, and I just need to say, of course, the conference was packed with a lot of great speakers on the topics of the life issue, religious freedom, conscience rights, host of other issues. But you moved me in a way, partly because I've been involved with the pro-life movement for most of my adult working life, and I consider this part of my life's calling. But one of the things you said there, you got very transparent, David, about how after the Dobbs ruling, which essentially did away with the Roe v. Wade precedent that nationalized abortion, and Dobbs gave the issue of right to life laws and abortion back to the states. But you had shared that you were disappointed, in a very, maybe that's not the right word, disheartened, grieved, because you saw that all of the work that you did and that the pro-life movement did over the years, it seemed to evaporate. It was not embraced. The Dobbs ruling was not embraced. We saw many states react, either through constitutional amendments that they rejected or constitutional amendments that solidified abortion laws or made abortion a right in their state constitutions. A number of things happened that were discouraging out there on the pro-life front. Can you speak to that for just a moment before I jump into some of these other questions?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your history of being involved in the pro-life movement, Richard. And I think for every person who's listening to us have this conversation, for those who've been praying, whether they've been investing their time, their talent, their treasure into pregnancy centers, right to life groups, policy issues, all of this, it really matters. And it really has carried us a tremendous way down the field that we need to go. What happened for me is when the Dobbs decision came down, and I'll never forget the morning when my wife and I were sitting in our living room having our Java with Jesus, our morning devotional time with coffee, of course, because otherwise I wouldn't be very sociable. And the Supreme Court announced that they had handed down not just the leak of the Dobbs decision, but the actual decision. And when my wife Margaret and I read the decision and realized that Roe v. Wade had been overturned, we wept with joy, and we were so incredibly grateful for everyone who had a role in getting us to that moment. But also, we started to realize there's still work left to do. We just didn't realize how urgent that work would be and what it would look like. So I think all of us, when we go from that date, June 24th, 2022, and that decision, fast forward to today when we're having this discussion, we look in and we say, wait a minute, I thought the Supreme Court made this sweeping decision on abortion, overturned Roe. We have to realize what they didn't do. They did not pass a protection on human life. They did not pass a sweeping ban on abortions. They simply, as you articulated, said the decision goes back to the American people through our elected officials in the states and in Congress. And so we have this sudden patchwork of 50 different state-by-state battlegrounds, each of them looking different. I've personally traveled just since the Dobbs decision to 47 of those states, including Kentucky, and I've seen places where things have gotten better. I've seen where places have gotten worse. But the overarching theme is we realize we're seeing shifts that we didn't expect for the worse across the board. A couple of examples of that. The actual number of abortions since before the Dobbs decision to today has gone up 21% nationally across the board. We've seen, as you mentioned, people crossing state lines. So states where there are strong protections, people are leaving by the droves to go to the states with loosened protections on human life. We've seen abortion pills being mailed all over. Now that's 70% plus of the delivery of abortions. And those are being mailed across state lines with no respect to individual states' sovereignty and their ability to make these state decisions. And we've seen the ballot initiatives. We've lost 14 out of 17 times where abortion has been on state ballots. Like Planned Parenthood, the largest abortion chain in our country, just posted their all-time highest annual abortion numbers, 434,000 last year. So when we look at this and say, wait a minute, I thought Dobbs was supposed to do it all, what it caused me to do, and I think many others that I've talked with, leaders, philanthropists, just ordinary people like us, everybody started realizing there's more than we may have originally thought. And so what I realized was, for far too long, I had this kind of assumption in my brain, which was if we work hard enough, if we mobilize enough people, if we win enough arguments, if we win enough elections, if we pray often enough, if we do all the right things, then the culture will follow. But what I recognized is the culture actually hasn't followed after one of the biggest wins we could possibly achieve. We've won arguments, we've won elections, we won the landmark Supreme Court case, and yet it's not doing what we hoped it would do. So that caused me to start this process, which we'll talk about, to research what was I missing and what does it actually take to create and hold durable, lasting transformation so that our children and our children's children will grow up in a true culture of life, not just this constant back and forth fighting where things keep moving against us. We've won some of the battles. We've not yet won the culture. And that is the work that lies before us.
David, and that's a good segue to something you said at the conference. You said that culture is not what a nation debates. Culture is what a nation assumes. Two questions here. So how do you define culture? And then I want to know what you think the United States of America, what our nation assumes.
That's a great question. So let me unpack those both. If I forget one, just pull me right back to it. So first of all, when I think about culture, and I used to have kind of nebulous ideas, but we talk about it all the time, but what is it? So culture are the ideas, the beliefs, the values that are no longer questioned. They're just the things that we accept as normal. So when we rewind the clock 100 years, what Americans thought was normal versus what we accept as normal today, radically different. So something had to change that. And so when I talk about what a nation assumes as opposed to what we're arguing today vigorously in our cultural debate, assumptions, I'm not talking about the guesses, right? I assume something might happen. No, I'm talking about those things that we just accept as normal. This is the way things are. So that's what we have to start looking at, is saying, A, what are those assumptions? We'll talk about that here in America. And then B, if we're not happy with those assumptions, are we willing to look and say, how do we change those assumptions over time? And the most important lesson I learned as I started digging into history and social science and talking with dozens of experts on these topics is that really culture change takes longer than I expected. And a lot of it happens through generational replacement. So you and I will be arguing and fighting for things that our children will then grow up and accept as new norms. So to answer the second part of your question, what are the assumptions that America rests upon today? Well, some of the founding principles are still there, although the interpretations of them have certainly shifted over time. Do we still value freedom, liberty, the rights to life and liberty and pursuit of happiness? We value them, but the assumptions have shifted about what those look like. We've also had assumptions from a season in the past where maybe our parents' or grandparents' generation, they valued you work really hard. Your life is to serve raising your children and to better the culture. We've become more of a nation that revolves around selfishness and personal interest. And how do I, me, how do I reward what I want rather than what am I doing that's in the best interest of others? So even when I looked at, I'll just use the culture of life for a moment, there were several factors that shifted us from being a nation that did have that foundational in the Declaration of Independence, right? The right to life. Our Creator gave this to us before birth. This is the right. Why did we fall so far away from that? And you can trace it through aspects of the sexual revolution, but there were a couple seismic shifts that really began to change everything. I'll give you just one example. When abortion was moved out of the realm of talking about morals, which it was for most of history, and it was shifted very strategically into the realm of medicine. That was a seismic shift where instead of saying, what does my pastor think? What do my family members think? What does my community think? And using that to help shape our morals and values as it relates to the dignity of life and abortion. Instead, you have some activist medical professionals in these elite institutions, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Medical Association, who are actually gaming the systems of the medical associations not to reflect the mass of their members, but to try to use the medical institution to shape the way people behave. And then over time, their beliefs would catch up with it. I wish we had a lot of time to really unpack this, but what we really have to understand is that we've seen this happen before our eyes, whether it's the breakdown of marriage and family, whether it's the decline in religious beliefs and values, whether it's the moral slide, all of these things, we can look at what the previous assumptions, what was normal versus what is normal today. And then for us to say, what do we want the normal for our children and grandchildren to be? And how do we learn from history to begin architecting, and with God, all things are possible, building that better culture for future generations. So there's so much here we can unpack.
If you're just joining us, you're tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm here with David Bereit, the Executive Director of the Life Leadership Conference, and we are talking about the pro-life movement, cultural assumptions, and where does the pro-life movement go from here. We're going to take a quick break, so don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. Here at the Commonwealth Policy Center, we believe that every Kentuckian deserves a voice in Kentucky's capital, not just a special interest. But we don't have the deep pockets of the Kentucky lobby. That's why in America's 250th, we're asking 250 families to partner with us monthly at just $25. Your support ensures that you have a voice in Kentucky's capital. Please scan the QR code and join us in the fight for Kentucky's future, or visit our website at commonwealthpolicy.org and donate today. Welcome back to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson, here with David Bereit, and we are talking about the pro-life movement. David, just before the break, we were talking about culture and cultural change and how ideas are embraced. And one thing you said at this the Alliance Defending Freedom Conference was you describe a pattern of lasting change that involved, it starts with ideas develop, ideas spread, and ideas become embedded. The pro-life movement, and I'd like you to address that, but the pro-life movement has talked about creating a culture of life, which I believe, and again, I've been part of this pro-life movement for some 30 years, and I believe that I've been dedicated to that largely in the political and public policy arenas. But have we done something? Have we gone about this wrong? Have we not seen this progression of lasting change in the culture? Speak to that, if you would.
Yeah. Okay. So let me go back to the 3 stages. The reason this came up to me was when I started wrestling with this, what did I miss? I began a deep research project to ask the question, how does culture actually change? Not what do I think, what do biased advocates think, but what does history teach us? What does social science show? And are there patterns if we were to look across a breadth of cultural transformations? So I ended up finding 34 major culture shifts in the United States in the last 100 years that all fit certain criteria. They were relatively rapid, they had seismic shifts in the culture, and they were durable. They actually lasted after the change. And so I drilled down into each of these and then tried to find, are there threads of patterns and frameworks that fit across all of these? I'm still in the midst of this investigation. It's fascinating. I believe there's a whole lot more I will be uncovering as I keep working through this. But what I found very quickly was there was this consistent pattern of essentially 3 phases of culture change. And you mentioned the first one is ideas develop. I call that phase incubation. And it's usually a very quiet period where the general public doesn't even know there are people architecting the next chapter of history. There are people planning ideas. There are people talking about stories and storytellers. They're thinking of institutions that they need to infiltrate to be able to get their idea out. They're doing things very quietly. They're also, and I'm going to come back to this, they're setting up a service infrastructure to make their new norm more livable. And I want to come back to that point. But that's incubation. The ideas are developing. This frequently can take 10, 15, 25 years quietly where nobody sees it happening until suddenly it bursts into that second phase you described as ideas spread. I call that acceleration. And usually there's some sort of a tipping event, something that happens in public. It usually can't be architected, but when something happens, the incubation work has been done, and then those ideas burst out into the public. They start to go into the different institutions that shape our culture, the media, academia, the church. They go into entertainment and arts. They go into these places that shape the broad sectors of the culture, and they start to get embedded where the institutions initially start to reinforce these new ideas, and over time they start to enforce these new ideas. And we've seen that for some of the negative backlashes of culture changes that we would recognize as very detrimental to our future generations. But then the third phase, which is also important, is the lock-in, and that's where all these ideas are no longer being developed. They are being embedded. They are locking in through the law, through policy, through boring things like IRS tax codes, and through HR policy. They're becoming institutionalized, and that last part I mentioned earlier, you have a new generation grow up. That's all they've ever known. They accept that as the norm. So we as the pro-life movement, to kind of end that question you asked, we've spent a large portion of our energy, this is not bad, on elections and laws. And we've poured a lot into that while we haven't done as much work in the upstream. It doesn't mean that we did the wrong thing. It just means now we have to look and say, what more incubation and acceleration work do we need to do so that Dobbs and other legal decisions in elections can stick?
That's a perfect segue, and I agree with you, and that really captured my imagination. Even though I've been in the electoral, public policy making realm for most of my life, and that's where our focus has been, and it's a worthwhile arena to engage. And yet at some point, even before your talk and when I'd heard you, it just confirmed what I had felt years before Dobb, that until the culture and the populace embraces an idea, it's not just passing a law or getting a pro-life leader into office, and both of those things are good and important, but until those ideas are truly embraced at a heart level, we're still the same people.
That's
so
right.
Here's the question, David.
Sure.
So culture is upstream from politics. What does upstream, and I use that in quotes, upstream look like for the pro-life Christian community, right? In our families, churches, employers. Does it mean that we need to get into Hollywood and start making the movies? Does it mean that we need to get into the music industry? Do we become digital creators? Is it, or maybe all the above? Speak to that. What does working upstream look like? Yeah, tell us more.
So first of all, to understand, again, we have to each look at the unique talents, gifts, and skills and experiences God has given us and say, Lord, where do you want me? What's my piece of Nehemiah's wall, right, that I'm supposed to go build here? So in no way is it to diminish the importance of legal and policy work. For some people, that is their lane. That's critically important. It's merely to say it alone is not wholly sufficient. That's why this other work matters. So for some, it is, how do we tell a story better? I'll give you two examples here. One was a fascinating thing that I found in my early research was what was termed victim framing. Whoever does a better job of helping to communicate a victim that people empathize with will usually win the longer-term culture battle. So when we look at the current state of the pro-life movement, most of the times when we see these abortion ballot measures being debated, they're talking about some woman who they allege had a miscarriage and she couldn't get the help she needs, or someone who's pregnant with a child that could put the mother's life at risk. There's always an empathy that's created where people say, whoa, I don't know whether I want to completely ban abortion because I empathize, I have a heart for that person's plight. We have to do a better job of communicating the dignity of the worth of the child in the womb and humanizing that child every way we can, but also humanizing the mother that is helped when she comes across a person in faith, a church, a pregnancy center, a maternity home that says, I will help you, and walks with her. And then years later, she doesn't have the regrets that somebody who had the abortion did. So that's number one. Number two, do I have a moment? Can I share one other one really quickly, or do you want to do this after the break?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
One more. Yeah.
So the other one was, I mentioned the service infrastructure. So many culture changes that I saw, they, in the incubation stage, said, how do we serve a real need that people feel, whether it's a right service or a wrong service? so that over time they feel that there's a path of less resistance to live this new norm. We in the pro-life movement have that, and we just need to put it up on steroids, and that is our pregnancy help centers. Yeah. It's the pregnancy centers, the maternity homes. These centers are providing enormous help for mothers who are facing an unexpected pregnancy, but 34% of Americans in national polling we did don't even know they exist. So we need to raise awareness about the help that is available so that mothers know abortion's not their only option. We as believers need to walk alongside mothers in the messiness of their real life situations, and we have to be there with her through the pregnancy. And yes, after the child is born, we have to build that support system to show our love in action so that when we are championing policy and elections and laws, our love led the way, not just a shrill voice that they feel you don't understand my situation.
David, that's well said. I couldn't agree more. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment, so don't go away. Here at the Commonwealth Policy Center, we believe that every Kentuckian deserves a voice in Kentucky's capital, not just a special interest. But we don't have the deep pockets of the Kentucky lobby. That's why in America's 250th, we're asking 250 families to partner with us monthly at just $25. Your support ensures that you have a voice in Kentucky's capital. Please scan the QR code and join us in the fight for Kentucky's future, or visit our website at commonwealthpolicy.org and donate today. Welcome back to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, your host, and we are talking about the pro-life movement, cultural engagement, and how true and lasting cultural change takes place with David Bereit. David, I want to share a statement that Crystal Parker with the U.S. Christian Chamber of Commerce stated. She reacted and reflected on your Alliance Defending Freedom talk, and she summarized your approach with this phrase: Jesus did not start with Caesar, he started with disciples. So I think this is what we've been talking about. It's not just getting political change first to change the culture. It starts with hearts and minds, which is a discipleship function. So what does this mean in the context of the pro-life movement? What does this mean for Christian engagement in public life today? Do we simply need to be more about discipling when we step into the public arena and maybe sharing our convictions and our values at that level before pivoting to issues like the sanctity of life? What does that look like for Christian engagement in public life?
Yeah. It's funny you bring this up because just yesterday morning I was doing a Bible study specifically around what does Scripture say to us about these topics that I'm wrestling with right now: culture change and elite institutions and what our role is and all of that. And when I looked at the life of Christ, and I even looked at the Great Commission at the end, he did say, "Go and make disciples of all nations and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you." So it was kind of a both and. And I think in that way, we can look at it and say, all right, first of all, am I myself a good disciple? And some of that may mean we're sinners. I come before you as a sinner, saved by grace and saved by Jesus Christ. But we have to all look and say, what do I need to do to grow in my own spiritual journey in holiness? Like, am I spending enough time in the Word? Am I going to church regularly? If people saw my life when I think nobody's looking, would they say he really means what he says when he preaches these words? So just first of all, assess our own, how am I as a disciple of Jesus Christ? Number two, say, what are the concentric circles of influence that I have to be able to make disciples? For me, as a husband and as a father, the first circle is my own family. Am I raising children, striving to the best of my ability in a fallen world to influence them to know, love, and serve God and to be His disciples? And then do we, beyond that, the people around us in our church, in our community, in the world, are we inviting that discipleship as well? But it's not an either or, because part of how we do that is how we engage in the world. Because if you look at in scriptural stories of whether it's Joseph or you look at the Nehemiah story and you look at, there were people who were able to reach high levels of influence in government and then use that for God's glory. They were not conformed to the world, but they were engaged in the world. And I think for each of us to say, how do we do that? How do we balance our relationship with God, our relationships with others, and our sense of mission and calling to engage in the world? For some, that is going to be politics, policy, law. For some, it may be grassroots advocacy. For some, it may be running a school. Maybe it's pastoring a church. But for each of us to assess, where can I make a difference? And then to look and say, if I'm heavily engaged in the downstream, the lock-in that we talked about, are there things that perhaps either I could do in the upstream realm that I'm not doing, or do more of, or do better, or can I partner and work with those in the greater body of Christ who are working in those areas so that we're more cohesively working on all the elements of culture change together? I 100% agree with her comment, and I think it's yes, both and. I think we have to be and make disciples, and I think we are called to engage in the world and bring the light of Christ to a world that desperately needs it.
Yeah, that's good. David, we are running out of time, but I do want you to address this. At the beginning of the program, we talked about abortion drugs coming across state lines into Kentucky. It's technically illegal, but we really don't have teeth in our law, so there's that issue. And then also changing hearts and minds. Last governor's election cycle, we had a Democratic governor, and I don't think it necessarily has to be a partisan thing, but a Democratic governor who highlighted a very difficult and tragic circumstance. A young woman was raped by their stepfather, and the governor said, look, this is it's wrong. We need to protect her. And he stood against any pro-life laws. So those two, in the context of that, the getting further pro-life protections, and then I think related to this are the very difficult cases that I don't know if we've addressed those very well here in Kentucky. What would be your recommendations for the pro-life community as we respond? Let's just hone in on the difficult cases one, because they're both related.
Yeah. First and foremost, and I think, again, we're people of faith, we need to pray and ask God to guide and direct us, because sometimes this is beyond our capabilities, but with Him, we know all things are possible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Maybe for certain seasons, I led a group called 40 Days for Life for years, and part of what we called people to do is 40 days of intentional fasting around the pro-life issue. So maybe it's to fast for a season because some demons can only be driven out through prayer and fasting. So start there. Secondly, I would say we need to be better storytellers, and we need to find messengers who can convey the right messages in the right way. There are women who've been so horrifically harmed by an abuser. At the ADF Summit, we heard from some of them. An abuser would buy abortion pills and force them without her knowing it, and she would have a loss of the life of her child, and she's traumatized by that. That story needs to be turned into something that every American understands, and they to have that empathy, right? We talked about. Yeah. For the other horrific situations, whether it's, I have friends a dear friend whose mother was date raped years ago. She ultimately felt called not to abort the child, praise God. She gave birth to this baby, placed him for adoption, and 25 years later, he looked her up and was able to find her, and he thanked her, and his now wife thanked her for giving him life. So we need to take these stories and tell the beauty of the dignity of life, not merely what's so wrong about what others are saying. And I think if we do that, whether it's the abortion pill crossing state lines, whether it's calling upon the administration to say we need to enforce the laws that can require in-person doctor visits so women are not affected by this, and protecting state sovereignty to be able to pass laws, or whether it's telling stories to the general public to counter the negative and wrong messaging of those who have, again, they're at the behest of the abortion industry trying to push a narrative. We have to push God's narrative of eternal truth with the stories that reflect that. When we do that, I believe we will be able to change hearts and minds and begin to see some of that cultural shift we're looking for.
David, that is so good. I wish we had more time to carry on this conversation, but we are out of time. I want to give you the last word, though, and tell us about how people can find more information about you. I think you'd mentioned a website when we were off the air for a moment. Tell us a little bit more where they can find you and maybe other good work that you're doing. you close it
Yeah,
off.
well, thank you very much. I'm right now in the midst of this deep investigation still into how culture changes. And as a result, I'm actually doing this investigation publicly. I'm sharing things at the ADF Summit. I'm sharing investigations. I'm looking at history. I'm talking to experts. If you would be interested in going on this journey and learning what I'm discovering and figuring out how to apply it to the culture change you want to see happen, I've set up a simple website at howculturechanges.com, howculturechanges.com. And that's going to be the repository of all my most important thinking and work in this stage, and it'll lead you to everything else about me if you're interested in following. But Richard, thank you for inviting me here, and for the person listening, thank you for wrestling with these big questions. And together, I believe we can do some great things to make a better world for our children and our children's children and future generations.
David, thank you so much for joining us here on the Commonwealth Matters. God bless you and keep up the great work.
Thanks. God bless you.